So glad all of you are here for B'nai Jeshurun's Talmud class. We call it Disputes for the Sake of Heaven. And we're going to have a whole conversation about what a dispute, what does it mean to dispute something, or what is it for the sake of heaven? And we're not going to do that today. We're going to sort of use that as a framing for all of our conversations. Last week, if you were here, we got a chance to have everybody introduce themselves, and we sort of jumped right in to the text. We learned about one of my favorite texts. But this week I wanted to do something else. I wanted to just step back for a moment and talk a little bit about what Talmud is, and then we'll dig in. I have a feeling this will be a two-parter in the sense that we may not finish the text this week and revisit it next week, but we'll see. We're not in a rush. We will cover whatever we cover. So I wanted to start off and put Talmud into context. And so what I want to do is the following. I'm going to share my screen, and you let me know if this works. Give me a thumbs up if you can see this text. Can everybody see it? Yeah? Okay, cool. Great. So this is, I snagged this.
Rabbi, what is this text supposed to say? I see a chart.
It is a chart. Sorry, that might be my fault because I used the wrong noun. Yes, you are supposed to be looking at a chart. So it sounds like you're in the right place, Nelson. Thank you for popping up. So what we see here, and I put this is originally from Wikipedia, but the content is accurate, which is we're talking about a series of texts of conversations that were recorded over a number of centuries, and then ultimately documented. So the story that these rabbis are telling over time is basically the following. God gave the Torah on Mount Sinai, but not just one Torah, the written Torah, the thing that we read from on Saturdays and Mondays and Thursdays, but also this thing called the oral Torah. Now, whether or not you think this is historically true or not is certainly up to your own personal belief, but that the narrative that the rabbis are telling themselves and that we continue to tell is that these two Torahs lived in parallel, and that the rabbis are helping us sort of bring down this oral Torah and make it available to all of us. And so we have these different eras of rabbis and proto-rabbis that I want to point out now. Okay, so we have these different categories of people on top. The Zugot are the famous pairs. So one famous pair of rabbis you may have been familiar with are Shammai and Hillel. If you raise your hand if you recognize those names in any way, shape, or form. And if not, that's okay too. Cool. So the Zugot were these periods. There's about, I think, 7 of them, if I remember correctly, of these generations of pairs of teachers. They, as you can tell, precede the Common Era. They are, the temple is still standing. The leadership of the rabbis is intact, is before the Roman conquest of the land of Israel. That period and the period that follows, where the temple is destroyed, and you have the Bar Kokhba revolt, and you have the rabbis really coming into a form of leadership of their own, those early rabbis are called the Tanaim, right here, the Tanaim. And Tana is an Aramaic adaptation of the word Shana, which we know as year, but is really also this concept of repetition, of cycles, that the rabbis were constantly repeating these texts, like in oral Torah, these oral learnings. And so the Tanaim simultaneously refer to these rabbis of this early period, as well as the human voice recorders who would memorize these texts and basically be able to repeat them back at this time. The Torah, sorry, I don't want that box. I want this one. The rabbis from this period, can everybody see the red box? Yes? The rabbis who taught during this period of time, their teachings are documented in a variety of texts, primarily the Mishnah, which is a collection of texts from that time period, and then parallel texts. So early Midrash Rabbah, and things like that come from this time period. There's another a collection called the Tosefta, not to be confused with the Tosafot, the Tosefta. And anytime in the Talmud you see the word Baraita, it's quoting a rabbi from this time period. So everybody with me so far? All right, this section is what is really the creation of the Mishnah, the Tosefta, and the Braitot. The Talmud, or the Gemara, if you will, reflects, oops, these boxes aren't working for me today. Let's try this, see if that one works. No, one more time. Great, here we go. The Gemara, which we usually sort of, and I use very interchangeably with the word Talmud, documents conversations that were happening in this second two generations of rabbis. The second after the Tanaim are the Amoraim, which should sound very much like the verb in Hebrew, amar, to say. They are the ones who spoke about the teachings of the rabbis in the Mishnah and commented on them and argued and discussed them. This is the time period that we are focused. These two time periods are the source of the materials that we're learning. The Savoraim are less defined. They are the word savar in Hebrew and Aramaic. It's like thinking. They're like using logic and stuff like that. And so it's the Savoraim in this time period that they redacted all of the teachings that were happening at the time into a document that we now call the Talmud and Midrash and all these other things. Is everybody with me so far? Thumbs up if so. And if not, raise your hand. Now is a great time to ask a question. I have more to share, but now's a good time. Yeah, Nelson. Oh, you got to unmute yourself.
I'm sorry, but I'm confused as to what the Savarim is. It's a different kind of question. If I was going to pick up a Talmud text, I thought it would only be the first box. Okay, I'm with you so far. But there's lots of discussion of that Talmud text, and it starts or maybe in the second box.
Yeah, so in the Talmud, we have three voices that we hear. We hear quotes from the Tanaim and the Zugot, Hillel, Shammai, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. All of those folks are Tanaim and from the Zugot. And we're going to see quotes from them, and we do. The Amoraim come back to say, who are they? They're discussing the quotes from the Tanaim and arguing. The third voice we see, though unnamed, are the people who are doing the editing. We don't always think about an editor as a voice that we see or hear, but these texts were floating, they were oral. The fact that they were organized into arguments, into discussions, is the work of the Savoraim. They are the ones who are redacting and editing the content. So we don't always see them quoted, but the construction of the stories, later on, not today, but another week, we're going to learn one of my, a great text, a series of texts on longevity. It's one of my favorites. And those stories probably didn't happen all together. The Savoraim and the editors put together those stories of longevity. So we're seeing their voice in their editing. Does that make sense, Nelson?
Better. Do we know who these people are?
We do not really know who the Savoraim are. We do not really know, because we don't have their names the same way. And then we have the Gaonim and the Rishonim and the Achronim who come much later. We're not going to focus on them, but they are the various rabbis who are commenting on the Talmud, the Tosafot, Rashi, the Vilna Gaon. All of those folks fall into these other categories. David, or I think, and Deborah, right? We were muted, so I didn't hear you if you were saying something.
Keep forgetting to unmute. Question about authority. It seems to me that at least from what I've learned up till now, there are potentially at least two sources of authority. One is that it precedes the current discussion, if you will, or it's older. And the other is that it's, if you will, persuasive, becomes normative because people were persuaded, adopted, it's attractive, it makes sense, however you want to look at that. Sometimes they overlap, sometimes perhaps they don't. But with respect to the first one, since we organized this into these categories of Tannaim and Amoraim, and the first one in theory is more authoritative because it comes earlier. How do we really know that the quotation really is from earlier, as opposed to it was redacted that way for the second reason, to make it more persuasive? I mean, it doesn't maybe matter because it's accepted as authoritative, maybe because it is persuasive, but for some people anyway, it also needs to be older. Could you comment on that, please?
Yeah, so the rabbis certainly are more inclined to accept an earlier teaching as more authoritative than a later teaching. Meaning to say that an Amora can't contradict a Tana and let that stand on its own. That the Tana is going to have more authority than an Amora. And the rabbis accept this as sort of a way of doing things. That being said, right, we are coming centuries and centuries and millennia later, and we sort of have to trust what the Gemara is saying, the Talmud is saying about itself. We can tell the difference in some cases, not in all cases, the various layers that are being edited together. So for example, the Tanaim are always writing in Hebrew for the most part. Almost always writing in Hebrew. Mishnah and Breita, they're almost always in Hebrew. And the Amoraim are writing in Aramaic. And so we can already start to tell, if you, in some academic contexts, you can see they've highlighted by different colors the different layers being edited together. So the question of authority is an interesting one in broad sense, because the rabbis, if you imagine, there's probably a few hundred of them hanging out in each other's basements arguing. And the question of whether or not they were really all that authoritative in the community is debatable. And so in part, we sort of accept the narrative they tell about themselves and the way that we tell, the stories that we tell even today. So it's not as simple yes or no, but they definitely have an inclination that, that earlier texts are going to be more authoritative. I want to show two more things, and then we're going to we'll jump right in.
Before you move on, I guess what I'm saying is I'm challenging that notion in a different way. If I wanted to make something more authoritative by making it older, I would naturally write it in Hebrew to make it seem as if it's from the period of the Tanaim, whether it is or not when I'm editing the Talmud. So can we tell from the style of the Hebrew or any other clues as to whether something is actually that old? And even if we can't, we could still accept it as authoritative because maybe it makes sense, or maybe we are arguing on it in the modern era, or maybe we're even going so far as to say, if the rabbis of the Talmud live now, maybe they'd come out with the minority opinion rather than what seems to be the majority opinion. And I think maybe that's what separates us a little bit from the Orthodox, but I don't want to go too far. So I just throw that out there as a challenge, and I think it's interesting as a point of discussion, but I obviously not really sure.
Yeah, I'll say the following, which is that the rabbis themselves don't, there are certainly appears as though there are Breitot, so teachings from the same period as the Mishnah, so Tannaitic teachings, that seem very convenient. But we don't really know how real or not real they are. And sometimes the rabbis are like, did that person really say that? That doesn't make a lot of sense. And so we don't really know. And it's part of the puzzle. And we can even say that this seems suspect, but we're going to take them at their word. And then maybe we won't. That's part of the beauty of being a modern student. All right, Ron, before I get to you, I want to just do two things, but I won't forget you. The Talmud is split into 6 orders And at the bottom, you see the 6 orders of Mishnah. So the Tanaim of the Mishnah, they're broken into these various orders, these sort of like major divisions. And inside each division order are Masechtot, tractates. And then inside of those, there are chapters. And then, of course, the most confusing thing, Mishnayot, single individual Mishnahs. So Mishnah simultaneously describes each individual unit as well as the overall document. So we last week studied from Masechet Megillah, which is here under Moed, which is loosely about holidays. And today we're going to learn from Bava Metzia, which is under Nezikin, which is like damages. We'll get into that when we get into that. Okay. I'm going to share one last thing, and then I'm going to go to you, Ron, which is, this is a document, I don't remember where it comes from, I certainly didn't make it, that talks a little bit about, it's more about focused on halakha, on Jewish law, than it is the Talmud. But I wanted you to sort of like see them in a different order, which is you have the written Torah, the Mishnah, who is ostensibly speaking about Torah, from Torah, and that the comments that are happening by the Tanaim and the Moraim are edited into 2 separate Talmuds. The Jerusalem Talmud, which is comes from the land of Israel, is slightly earlier. It's a lot less organized. And the Babylonian Talmud, which comes slightly later and is much more organized. They have slightly different dialects of Aramaic. And the Babylonian Talmud is by far the more primary studied material. I will say, if you're familiar with the website Safaria, Safaria has just either published or is publishing a English translation of the Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, for basically the first time, but it's pretty monumental. So that is going to be more accessible now than ever. Okay.
Can you make it bigger?
Yes, I'm sorry. Thank you. Here's the part that I really want you to see. Is that better?
Yeah, it is.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for mentioning that. Cool. All right, Ron.
Yeah, my comment goes back to what David was talking about giving more credence to earlier texts. And I think a great example of that is the Zohar. It was written whenever it was written, but it was attributed to a much earlier generation, just to give it credence.
Yeah, I think that's a great example. I mean, the Zohar is probably written in the 12th, 13th, 14th centuries and written as if it was from the Tannaitic period. Linguists are able to sort of tell the difference in terms of making, in terms of the sort of changes in language, but that's a great example. So I want to just say I just want to give you one last note, which I think will help, which is Mishnah plus Gemara is Talmud. So if you imagine that the Mishnah is this earlier text period, the Gemara is the discussions happening, and together they are the Talmud. Lots of people, including myself, will use Gemara and Talmud interchangeably, but we probably shouldn't. And when we look at the text, which we're about to do right now, I know a lot of bouncing between screens, you'll see in this version, and I've got some boxes on here, and so we'll talk about what that means in a second, the actual text of the Talmud will include these phrases, in this case, the abbreviated word matnitin, which means our Mishnah, where it's going to quote from the Mishnah directly. And here, Gimel Mem, abbreviated from Gemara, to show that these discussions are different. Now, this is can everybody see this okay? Thumbs up? Awesome. What we're looking at here is a page from the Koran Talmud. It's a recently, and I say recently because it's probably 10 years old or 15 years old now, Talmud publication in English. On the left side on this page, you see the text from the Talmud itself, split into sort of smaller paragraphs. That's what you see here. If we scroll down, we see another one here. And on the English side, it's translated, but not, but it has extra information. The bold text is the direct translation of the Talmud onto the left, the text from the left. So in this case, and I know the boxes might be distracting, it says just as, and then it goes right to exploitation. Those two phrases are the first two words in the Mishnah. The phrase, there is a prohibition against, is Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz's commentary, which was originally written into modern Hebrew, translated into English. Meaning to say, the editors interlinearly put in Rabbi Steinsaltz's commentary to help us understand it. Could we read it without? For sure. Is it helpful? Yes. Does it sometimes disagree with other commentators? Also yes. So we take it with a grain of salt. It's very helpful, but we take it with a grain of salt. Before I get to the boxes, does anyone have any questions about what they're seeing on the page? No, cool. I added the boxes because I want, oh, yes, Tybal.
Sorry, just to throw it in there, the way you said, sometimes people say Talmud, but they mean Gemara, not Mishnah plus Talmud. It's a little confusing. I just wanted to say, a lot of times, but I think it's a beautiful thing, people say Torah, and they mean all of the above.
Yes, so there are certainly folks, including myself, who use Torah to talk about the broader endeavor of sharing Jewish wisdom, right? And so I think, yes. However, when we're being slightly more accurate, I think it's really, really important. Like if we want to be more, we want to make sure that we're referring to the things we actually mean. We do want to be clear that when someone says Torah, they don't necessarily mean a specific piece of text from the Talmud or the Gemara. But yes, I agree that the broader endeavor it can be described as Torah. Okay, the box is on the screen. In part, in addition to the content itself, I want to make sure that we're learning about how Talmud functions. And so in this case, I've added boxes on both sides where you can start to see how the Talmud constructs arguments in these little blocks. And when they're in the same paragraph, I use different colors so that we wouldn't get confused. And we'll use the first one as an example. So in the Hebrew, it says kashem, that's the first box, that's right here. And then the phrase kach. Those are a construction together that tell us, that are translated as just as, and so too, or here it's so is. Meaning to say, it's making a comparison. Just as X is true, so too Y is true. Is everybody with me so far? So each of the boxes refers to something like that. And as we go through, we'll refer to those things so that we can get a sense of how these things fit together. And that when you read a piece of text later and you see these phrases, you'll be able to, even if you don't know the Hebrew, you'll be able to say, oh, I know what kind of discussion or argument's going to come here. Okay. That was a lot of background, but I think really useful. And I know that these videos are going to be uploaded onto the B'nai Jeshurun's YouTube channel, at least I believe so. So you can always review this if you feel like, well, what did he say? I don't remember exactly. You can always review it later. Okay. I would love for someone to read for us the Mishnah in English. Would someone like to volunteer? You can use the raise hand function if you want, which is under the reactions button at the bottom, or you can wave into the screen and I'll hope to see it. Anyone want to volunteer first? Nobody has to. Yeah, great, David, thank you.
Nobody ever accused me of not having enough hot air, so to speak, to read a passage. So anyway, from the Mishnah, just as there is a prohibition against exploitation, ona'ah, in buying and selling, so is there ona'ah in statements, that is, verbal mistreatments. The Mishnah proceeds to cite examples of verbal mistreatment. One may not say to a seller, for how much are you selling this item, if he does not wish to purchase it. He thereby upsets the seller when the deal fails to materialize. The Mishnah lists other examples. If one is a penitent, another may not say to him, remember your earlier deeds. If one is a child of converts, another may not say to him, remember the deeds of your ancestors. As it is stated, and a convert shall you neither mistreat nor shall you oppress him. Exodus 22:20.
Wonderful, thank you. So a couple of things. One is, the Mishnah and this translation puts he in place of, because grammatically they are often male. I'm just going to let you know that often when I translate by myself, and you'll hear me say this in the future, I often will gender neutralize it, especially when gender isn't a relevant person, relevant to the understanding of the text. Just fair warning that if you hear me say they instead of he, I'm doing it on purpose. So here we see in the Mishnah two things, or three. First, we're getting a comparison. Just as Kashem, there's a prohibition in terms of purchasing things, ona'ah, right, buying and selling. You can defraud somebody. So too, there is a thing called ona'at devarim, or ona'ah devarim, bid-devarim, which is that there is fraud in terms of how you use words. Here it's translated as verbal mistreatment. So that's the first thing. The second thing that happens in the text is we get an example. You may not do X. And then we get a few others. If X, then Y. If X, then Y. If X, then Y. And then at the end, we get proof, at least for the last example, right? Remember the deeds of your ancestors. So we have this example, and in the Hebrew, it says, Shene'emar, as it is said. And we have this quote from Exodus, and a convert shall you neither mistreat nor shall you oppress them. And this was actually only a few weeks ago in the Torah, that we read it a number of weeks ago. I think it was Parshat Bahar. So here we have these three things happening in the text. Ron, please.
I always have a problem with the word ger, because sometimes it means stranger, and sometimes it means an alien living among you, and sometimes it actually means a convert. How do we know which this is?
That is a great question. And I agree with you that we should be very hesitant in our translations. We should always be really careful. I'm not going to answer the question now because I think the text itself will answer that question. So we'll just keep it in the back of our head. But I think it's good. We should interrogate the text, certainly the translation, to get a sense of whether or not this is accurate. In this case, I think it is. And we'll get into that when that comes. I think in part the reason why is that we're talking about Ben Gerim, a child of converts. And so it's a specific case in which we're talking about someone who is converted. But we're going to get into it because the Gemara is going to break down this whole thing. Before we move to the Gemara, anyone else have any comments about the Mishnah? What about this idea of ona'at devarim? Do we like this concept? Do we agree with this concept? Yeah, Eric.
So I'm a little concerned about the statement saying one may not say to a seller, for how much are you selling if you don't want to purchase it? Obviously, the question is being asked to determine if the price sounds reasonable to make a decision to purchase or not. So that sort of prohibits even asking the question.
Right. So you're saying in the circumstance where I might buy it if it's at a good price, right? I might be hesitant to then ask if that's the case. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
Fortunately, I had a dropout, so repeat the question. Repeat what you said.
Right. So my understanding of your challenge to this, and I think a reasonable one, is if I am willing to purchase it, but I want to know the price first, right? And I ask them, this might prevent me from doing that. I would just push back to say, if you internally, this is a power of intentionality, right? If I say to myself, if the price is good enough, I might buy this very seriously. As distinct from, I'm going to ask, but I'm never going to buy it.
Yeah, that's two different things. And the way that's written to me says that you're not allowed to ask the price at all. To me, that's a decision point. So if the price is reasonable, yes, I'm going to go ahead and buy it. The prohibition is that even if the price is reasonable, you have no intention of buying it. That's something else. Right. But there's one piece of this that seems to be missing.
Cool. Great. Good observation. Tybal, Nelson, and then Ron.
The way I've heard other Talmud teachers explain this in the modern day, which is someone who knows they're going to buy online. They absolutely know, but they want to figure out how much of a deal or what it should cost or something. Or even worse, they want to buy it online, but they don't know like which color exactly or which formulation. So they go in and take a shopkeeper's time and in person and raise that person's hopes. And it's like stealing, not to go on and on, but I am. It's like stealing. It's not just raising the hopes, but they're stealing time. So
I think that's a great example.
So yeah. I think this is the modern example. If you're deciding to save money and you know you would never buy in person because all you care about is the price, then you can't go into a particular shopkeeper And at least the Talmud teachers with whom I've studied similar have said, it's not even just asking about the price. You can't even go in because you know there's no way you're going to buy it.
Yeah, so I don't think the text itself says the last piece about going in the store or not, but certainly there is some, we should have cause for hesitation. Nelson, Ron, and then Julie, is that a raised hand or just a thumbs up? It's a thumbs up.
Thumbs up.
Okay, great. Nelson.
I was just, Ty will led to think about another example, which is related, which is going into a store, no shopkeeper, so you can see it in person and decide whether you want to buy it online. So you're occupying space. Is that really prohibited? But I was also thinking of the question about an appropriate price. Appropriate sort of changes things a bit. You know, if this person tells me it's a price that's just amazing, I'll buy it. But that's unlikely. So that am I wasting their time or not? Just a question. And then I guess it's related to another question. I mean, they lead to each other, which is maybe what's supposed to. We've read online about this example in California where the gas station manager made a mistake and was selling gasoline, I think, for 69 cents a gallon. If you run across a price which is totally wrong or unexpected, can you take advantage of it? Is that exploitation? Let me stop.
No, those are great questions. I want to make one distinction, which is the first series of examples you gave fall into this category of ona'at devarim, of verbal fraud, right? Verbal mistreatment. How we use our time and resources in terms of how we're interacting with other people, as distinct from the last example about California, which is taking advantage of a monetary situation may or may not be in this category. It may be the question of fraud, but it may not be the same as ona'at devarim of verbal fraud. I don't know, but it's an interesting question. Ron, and then David, and then I want to move on.
Yeah, well, Ty will beat me to what I want to say. I think what she was referring to, though, was someplace in Pirkei Avot that says not to do that. But what I do when I go into a store, specifically a car dealership, but any store, and a salesman comes up to me and I have no intention of purchasing anything, I immediately tell them I am not buying anything today. I don't know if that absolves me or not.
I mean, I don't know if that absolves you either, but but that might be an interesting way of resolving this issue, which is to say, I'm not going to defraud them. I'm going to be really clear from the outset and say, look, I'm not going to buy anything, right? And I'm not going to take up your time asking you lots of questions, right? It's a great question. I don't know the answer. Yeah, David. Oh, you need to be unmuted.
I'm unmuted, thank you. Now, to try to get some clarification, what we're talking about is exploitation of another person one way or another, either in business or verbally. So it seems to me that if we turned it around and looked at it the other way around, maybe it's not a problem because there's no exploitation. In other words, if I go online and I look at a bunch of websites for, I don't know, a shirt I want to buy, and I look at the colors online, and I look at the sizes online, and I look at the patterns online, and then I go to the mall because I don't want to wait for it to be delivered, and I'm not sure really the quality of the material or what the color really looks like. And I go into a store and I see the shirt and I say, okay, that's the one I looked at online. That's my size. I tried it on. I like it. I like the color and I think it's made well. And I buy it from the store. I'm actually assisted by the internet in making the purchase, but I didn't exploit any person on the internet because the computers run very fast. Nobody even knows who I am. And it just helped me make the purchase. So that would be okay, or am I wrong?
It sounds like that would be okay based on the question of monetary fraud, right? But I want to make sure that we're making the important distinction, which is we're talking about this new concept of ona'at devarim, of verbal fraud or verbal mistreatment, which would not fall into what you're describing, right? You're describing something about Did I, can I buy something using various methodologies to get the best price or what have you? I don't want to wait. So I think your point is a good one, but I want to be really clear that I think we're talking about something that has it's more than just buying things. We use that first example. But we also have these other examples, right?
So it might be interesting though maybe the Gemara will get to this, so I don't want to, go off before we really get there. But it seems to me it relates to Ron's comment, because you could get yourself completely prepared to try to drive a good bargain and get the best price. And that wouldn't be exploitation per se, but maybe the Gemara will talk about how that relates to the possibility of verbal exploitation.
Yeah, no spoilers. We're going to move ahead and find out whether or not. So the first thing I want to point out, and here's the new paragraph, and I'd love to have a volunteer read it for us. The first thing I want to point out is this phrase, Tanu Rabbanan. Does everybody see that in the blue box? Tanu Rabbanan is two words. The first one is Tanu, which should sound very familiar to a category of rabbi we just talked about. Perhaps you might recognize the word Tanaim, which we talked about 15 minutes ago. Tanu Rabbanan is telling us, it's a code, right? We call these technical terms. It's like written in code. The code is telling us that the thing that's about to come is a quote from the rabbis, the Tanaim. And in this case, we haven't gotten the whole thing yet. But we know that the rabbis are going to teach that the period of time is from the Tanaim, which means we're talking about authority before, that the thing the Gemara is starting with is a quote from an authoritative voice. We're getting a quote from, probably not a Mishnah, because they use a different term for that. This is probably a parallel text that didn't make it into the Mishnah. Imagine the cutting room floor. They had all these texts, all these teachings, and it just didn't make it into the Mishnah. So it's in this category of Baraita. And we're going to get this Tanaitic teaching. Can I get a volunteer? Maybe somebody who hasn't said anything yet, who would like to read this next first paragraph. Anybody want to volunteer?
I'll do it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sheila.
The sages taught, it is written, and you shall not mistreat Tanu, one man his colleague, and you shall fear your God, for I am the Lord your God. The Tana.
Pause, Sheila. No, just pause for 1 second. You may notice that they're not quoting the original text in Exodus, but you may notice, if you were listening closely, that toneh and tonu are from the same root. And so this word of oppress, mistreat, is showing up here. That's part of our understanding. All right, please continue.
The Tana explains, the verse is speaking with regard to verbal mistreatment. The Braita proceeds, if you do not say that it is speaking of verbal mistreatment.
Do you say, it's going to be a question.
Oh, do you say that it is speaking of verbal mistreatment, ba'ona'at divarim? Or perhaps it is speaking only with regard to monetary exploitation, ba'ona'at mamon.
All right, pause. Thank you, Sheila. So we have this quote. The rabbis are saying, right, we have this quote from this Tanaitic source. It says we have this quote from Leviticus. And the Tana, the Braita, is saying, this verse is talking about verbal mistreatment. When you see the word tonu, that's the one that's from Parshat Bahar. I was excited about the verb, so I forgot which verse was from which parsha, but that one's from Bahar. This quote, "You shall not mistreat one person, their colleague," is the Tana is telling us this means verbal mistreatment. And then the Braita, this Tanaitic source, continues to say, well, maybe it isn't. Is it actually talking about ba'ona devarim, verbal mistreatment, or is it only referring to monetary mistreatment, fraud? Continue, Sheila. Let's get the answer.
When it says in a previous verse, and if you sell to your colleague an item that is sold or acquire from your colleague's hand, you shall not exploit his brother. monetary exploitation is explicitly stated. How then do I realize the meaning of the verse, and you shall not mistreat one man his colleague? It is with regard to verbal mistreatment. I think one of the problems that I'm having is the word colleague, and that, of course, I'm trying to find it in the Hebrew. It's ish et amito, meaning his friend.
Yeah, so the term is, amitecha or amito here, right?
I mean, what you go into a store, is that a colleague? I mean,
yeah, so these are quotes from the Torah. So the Torah is probably not talking about stores. There are a lot of questions about whether or not what this source of
they're
this
probably not talking about monetary in the Torah.
Well, I want to make two distinctions, right? One is we have this word from the Torah, amitecha, which is being translated as colleague, but it is also from the same root as as people. So this is like, someone you're part of your people, right? Your landsman, if you will.
That's dangerous, because then it's saying if he's not, I mean, then you could be accused of Jew taking advantage of a non-Jew.
Right. So it certainly could be translated and interpreted that way. The rabbis are not going to do that, but we can imagine how these texts might be misused. But I want to, and so putting that to the side, right? We'll take it at its value that it's really just talking about a person. Here we have the Braita come and say, we have this quote from Leviticus. The rabbi is telling us it refers to verbal mistreatment. And then it's like every good speaker asking themselves a rhetorical question that they know the answer to. Well, does it really refer to verbal mistreatment? Maybe it's only monetary mistreatment. And here's the answer that the rabbi gives, right, of this Braita, this early rabbinic source. The proof is we have this quote from 3 verses earlier, same chapter, right, verse 17 versus verse 14. In that case, when we use this verb tonu, which is not in the original text of the Talmud, right? They're actually quoting part of the verse that isn't mentioned, which is why it's good practice to always look up the verses when you study Talmud. Here, in the case, is the Rabbi Steinsaltz has given us the full quote. We have this verb tonu in context of sales, of selling things. The rabbi is saying, in that case, monetary exploitation, fraud is explicitly mentioned. We're talking about selling something. So therefore, the question is, how do I understand it in our case, which is the verse 17? Therefore, it must be where money was explicitly mentioned, that's about money, but in this case, it must be in reference to verbal mistreatment. Let me ask you this. Do you agree that that is a good argument for the existence of verbal mistreatment in this verse? Does everyone understand the question?
Not quite.
Okay, great. I'm glad thank you for saying so. So we have in this section 3 parts. We have the sages are telling us we've got this teaching. Teaching says we have a verse and it seems to refer to verbal mistreatment. So imagine, right, I'm reading, I'm giving a Devar Torah at the shul. I've come and visited you at B'nai Jeshurun. And I'm standing at the bima, and I said, we have this verse from this week's parsha, and it's Leviticus 25:17, and tonu, the verb mistreat, refers to verbal mistreatment. Let's imagine I've said that.
But wait a minute. When it says verbal mistreatment, there's a question right there. Is verbal mistreatment that you're changing the price of something? Or is it verbal mistreatment that you're making fun of the person and you say, oh, you're not going to buy, I'm not going to talk to you about it. Why don't you just, leave me alone?
So it's a great question that I'm not going to answer because the rest of the Talmud speaks to answer that question. So you're right in line with where the Talmud is going to go. So that is the question.
And I haven't studied this.
Good. But that's as it, we're all learning something new. We always do. So imagine at the moment that I am teaching, right, I'm telling you this verse refers to verbal mistreatment. And then you say, well, how do you know? Maybe it isn't. Maybe it just means don't defraud your neighbor. We then say, no, we have a different verse. That talks about money. This one must be about using our words. Yeah, David.
All I was going to add was that, yes, clearly the one verse does refer to monetary mistreatment, but that doesn't necessarily automatically mean that the other verse refers to verbal mistreatment, since it doesn't explicitly say that. So either it's verbal mistreatment or it's something else. If we say that the verses of the Torah, that the Torah is concise, so that if there's an extra verse, it must refer to something else. But how do we know it's verbal mistreatment?
If you were sitting in the room, I think that would be a perfect thing you could say to challenge this rabbi, which is it doesn't say verbal mistreatment or make any hint to it, right? The rabbis are making a declarative statement here. This is what we think it is. Bob, Ron, and then Tybal. And I know I keep saying the word Jeshurun, it should be Yeshurun, so forgive me for
Yeshurun.
Yeshurun, thank you.
You say B'nai Yeshurun. We spell it like it's spelled with a Y.
I appreciate it. Nelson, I see you as well, but I'm going to come to you last. So Bob, Tybal, Ron, and then Nelson.
I'm very literal, so if it doesn't say it, I don't infer from it. But that's the way my brain works. If it's not there, then prove it. I mean, if they wanted to say that, then if you wanted to say that, then say it. And if you don't say it, then it's not there.
Yeah, and I think that is certainly a valid worldview and way of approaching text. I don't think the rabbis would ascribe to that necessarily. They are associative thinkers, but I think it's a reasonable challenge. It doesn't say verbal. We should not assume it. Rabbi here in this case is. Tybal, Ron, and then Nelson.
It's a distinction in English, but I think it really starts mattering because there's such a difference in halakha between having witnesses that are there to speak their testimony and looking at documents. In English, the word verbal means words, which means it could be either spoken or written. It's that it's expressed in words. So I think part of the discussion, if we're more specific, whether it's spoken words or written words, I think given how it's not, actually, we have lawyers on this call. I know we have lawyers, and one is even a past president, right? Which I learned last week. Ta-da! So I don't know what's more probative in an American court, spoken witness testimony or notarized document, but we know for Jewish law that there's just no comparison. So I think when we say verbal now, we should say spoken verbal or written verbal to be clear, because some of us may be disagreeing or not getting it because we're actually talking about different things.
I do think that is an important distinction. And I don't think that's a distinction that the rabbis are making, which is to say, the words are here, the words are ona'at devarim, which is fraud of words, word fraud. And so it doesn't make the distinction between verbal versus written, although in the application of this law, we might make those distinctions. So I think it's important that I actually think the answer can be both. Ron and then Nelson.
You're probably not going to like me, and this is the reason I like to study online instead of in person, because I just pulled up the Talmud. The Torah, and this part of Leviticus, both 17 and 14, are referring to how you price something when you take into consideration the Jubilee year. And so it's neither of these quotes have anything to do with verbal or words. It has to do with monetary.
Yes, I love it. So in context, the rabbi, this text could be really just only about the way we treat each other in business. And this tractate, Bava Metzia, in context of Nezikin, the whole order, is absolutely all about how do we deal with each other when it comes to civil matters, right? When we deal with money and business and stuff like that. Right? It's called damages. What happens when my ox damages your ox. What do I owe you? However, the rabbis care about context when it helps them and ignore it when it doesn't. So yes, you are right that this context probably is just about business. But this Tana is telling us something really important, which is that words do matter and have an impact, and that to him, and I'm only assuming him because of the context and time period, that he's saying, no, it is also in reference to words. We don't have to agree, but that's certainly what the Gemara is saying. All right, Nelson, and then we're going to move on to the next paragraph.
Well, I assume in American business culture, exaggeration is pretty normal. The salesman will promise me the world, but they're exaggerating. And in that context, it seems to me that I can't rely upon this. I have to go with the culture. And I remember there was a question on the chat, which reminded me of an incident when I was younger. What about a culture that requires haggling, or expects haggling? I remember once being in a pawn shop looking at a watch, and I thought the price was too high, and I started walking out, and a very nice Jewish salesman said, "You're not going to haggle." You have to go with the culture. You can't walk into a store and expect the salesman's going to tell you exactly the truth. And when they promise you that you'll look beautiful or handsome or whatever, or become wealthy just by doing this, you know they're exaggerating.
Yeah, the question of haggling is a really good one. I see Eric, you put that in the chat. It's a really great point, and I'm not gonna. I don't know exactly how that fits in here. I think that is a real challenge to this, except for the following. If you are haggling and you have the full intention of being really willing, it's like something that you know, right? It's an intentionality that I'm willing to actually buy it if I can get a price that I like, versus haggling because it's fun to haggle, but I don't ever actually plan on buying it, is an important distinction. And it's not a distinction that someone else can know. It's only between you and yourself. And I guess God, if that's what you believe, right? So I think that's an important distinction. But I want to challenge us because I think we've gotten a little focused on the business examples, and I want to read one more paragraph that expands this out, because I actually think it's a much larger concept than just business. And in the box, we have this phrase, ha ketzad, which is the question, how does this work? How does this function? How so? So if this verse truly does refer to verbal mistreatment, which clearly is debatable, right? And as Bob said, it's not written in there, can't take it, I don't know for sure, right? How does this work? Can I get a volunteer to read for us this paragraph? Yeah, Eric.
How so? If one is a penitent, another may not say to him, remember your earlier deeds. If one is a child of converts, another may not say to him, remember the deed of your ancestors. If one is a convert and he came to study Torah, one may not say to him, does the mouth that ate unslaughtered carcasses and animals that had wounds that would have caused them to die within 12 months, straight boat, and repugnant creatures and creeping animals comes to study Torah that was stated from the mouth of the Almighty?
Okay, so this doesn't have anything to do with business. Thank you, Eric. So here's the example. How does this apply, this verbal mistreatment? Well, if someone is the phrasing is Baal Teshuvah, right? Meaning to say someone made an error and they've done tshuva, right? We're not just talking about how Baal Tshuva is used now. So it doesn't mean somebody who's become observant, but rather someone who has made an error and has now done the work to repair it, right? Doing tshuva, we're talking about high holiday themes here, right? If someone has really done tshuva, verbal mistreatment would tell us you cannot say to them, hey, remember this thing that you did? Right? I want to tell this to my wife when we're in arguments, but I haven't gotten the confidence to say that, when she says, well, you didn't really do this thing, right? So if I've done the work to repair something, someone shouldn't remind me of this thing that I did that was an error. Second example, if someone is a convert or a child of converts, and by the way, this is one of the sources for why you're not supposed to ask people about their conversion. You're not supposed to remind them that they are converted, that a Jew is a Jew is a Jew. It comes from this source, which is to say, you don't say to them, remember the deed of your ancestors, meaning to say, remember the fact that your ancestors weren't Jewish? We're not supposed to remind them of that. And here it's given even a further example. If someone is a convert and they come to study Torah, it means that they are a Jew. We should not say to them, does this person who didn't follow the laws, and uses the example of eating treif, right? You did all of these things. You think you can be, you can come and study Torah that comes from the mouth of God? Meaning to say, who are you? Right? You weren't really a part of us. This is saying, absolutely not. We don't say these things. This is what it means to use our words in a fraudulent way, to treat people badly with our words. So it's not just about business, but here about how we interact with each other. Yeah, David.
So we were just discussing briefly after what you just said, the possibility that somebody converts to Judaism, but they convert with a Reform rabbi. And yet we have at least some Jews, Orthodox and perhaps conservative too, who would say, did you really convert? How does something like that relate to this, especially if the person becomes more learned and is actually involved and doing things? In other words, that seems to me tricky, that somebody who just because their conversion isn't according to what somebody else would have liked, but now does everything perhaps more thoroughly and with greater enthusiasm and learning than many born Jews. How would this paragraph deal with that, or would it?
Yeah, so I want to say two things. One is we should be very careful about how we apply modern politics, and I would argue that this is politics more than anything else. Halakha certainly plays a role in terms of halakha of conversion, but that we shouldn't apply politics to this text in terms of orthodoxy, conservative, reform, and how we sort of agree and disagree with each other. So what it does say is that we should not be treating someone who is converted as anything less than someone who is born Jewish, that they have the exact same status. And that is what the halakha says more broadly. But here, that we don't continue to tell them, you're a convert and therefore less. That's what this is telling us not to do. And so we need to be extra careful about that. As the distinction of like, well, if somebody tells you about their conversion and whether or not it's halakhically appropriate is a question great for your rabbi to make a decision of. We certainly don't want to make broader principles than that. But basically, we should basically never ask someone or remind someone of their past in terms of conversion, because it would fall under this category. Zahava, please.
Yes, I don't see the connection between the two, because the first paragraph talking about not asking the price in order not to make the seller hopes go high. And with the convert, I understand maybe not to embarrass the person or just not to speak even as simple as Lashon Hara, which I get the two different paragraphs, but I don't see the comparison. I don't really see how they're equal. Of course, you should be careful of what you say, but I think the monetary part was not to put the seller in hope that he's going to have a sale. I don't know. Maybe I'm misunderstanding it. I just don't see the connection.
Sure. So I actually think, based on what you've described, you do understand the different categories quite well. I think the connection is we have this concept of ona'at devarim, and we're trying to understand what it means. That's what the Talmud is doing here, right? So if we scroll back here, right, we have this quote in the Mishnah, and it says, just as there is ona'ah in terms of buying and selling things, there is also this concept of ona'ah b'devarim, that we can do mistreatment with our words. The question becomes, what does that mean? What does that look like? How does it function? And that's the question that the Gemara is answering. The Mishnah offers a few examples. Buying and selling, talking about the seller and not getting their hopes up. But the Mishnah also offers these other examples. And now we're unpacking each one individually. So the first one asks the question of, well, maybe we're not talking about, maybe verbal mistreatment isn't a thing. Maybe the verse is only referring to business. And the Gemara is saying, no, it also refers to verbal mistreatment, meaning to say, yes, this category exists. And, we can agree or disagree with the Gemara's assessment of that. The second, and the second paragraph here of the Gemara is saying, okay, if there is mistreatment, a verbal fraud that isn't about business, what does that refer to? And the example here is given the way we speak to someone who has done tshuva, who is the child of converts, or they themselves have converted. How do we use our words in interacting with them? Just like how we use our words in interacting in business. Those are two now, or three, however many examples of how we use our words in perhaps a fraudulent way. And maybe fraud is a hard word because we're using it in such an expansive context. Zahava, does that feel like that helps?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Sheila, I'm going to give you the last comment because we're going to revisit this next week. We haven't finished the text. We'll come back next week.
Okay, I don't think it's that far afield, but the opposite side of this, we shouldn't say to a convert, why suddenly are you studying? Where have you, On the other hand, we do praise people for their yichus when they have great ancestors who have been very learned. It's the other side of the coin here, but it's an interesting.
Yeah, that is a great example. I've never thought of that. This might push us to say that maybe we shouldn't be talking about yichus. I don't know the answer to that. But this might lead us to say, it doesn't matter where you came from. You're here now, and you stand on your own 2 feet. Now, the counterpoint to that, of course, is we all stand on the shoulders of people who came before us. And so we don't want to lose that either. Again, I don't think it's one way or the other, but it does bring that challenging question of yichus, which for those who don't know the term, right, we're talking about ancestry and, if you've been related to somebody who's, a wonderful Torah scholar, perhaps so are you. No, it's a great challenge. Tybal, and you're going to get the last word.
Oh, okay. And I forget who commented, but Bob, somebody said that I said something for Pirkei Avos, no big surprise, because I just finished studying for 6 weeks. But I want to remind the Pirkei Avos verse that says there about the crowns, that the crown of a good name, which is what you make for yourself by implication, is greater than the crown of royalty, which one is born into, priesthood, which one is born into, and gender born into, and even Torah learning, that the crown of a good name exceeds the three, and that's Pirkei Avos.
I could not have said it better myself, so thank you for adding that additional piece of Torah. Yeah, it's a great challenge. It's a great question. And we're going to pick up next week about this concept of onat dvarim. So we're not done yet. We'll review what we did and we'll come back next week. We have this really challenging concept of onat dvarim, of verbal fraud. And it should challenge us to think about how we use our words, both for good and for not. And I'll just say one other thing. Which is, there's a sort of little Devar Torah piece to this, and then I know we're a little over time, which is, we know from the story of creation that God spoke the world into reality. Now, whether or not you believe that is true historically or not, certainly fine. But the narrative is telling us that words matter. They have the power to create, and here the power to destroy. Right? Words really do matter. And whether they're written or spoken or something else makes a difference. And so we obviously haven't resolved the situation yet. We still have more text to explore together. And we'll do that again next week. But I challenge you between now and next week to really ask yourself the question, what is onat dvarim? Are you seeing it in your daily life? Not necessarily participating. You don't have to out yourself, but certainly to challenge how do we use our words? What could this mean? All right, with that, have a wonderful Shabbat.